Welcome. I'm Kerriann Flanagan Brosky.
And I'm Joe Giaquinto.
And tonight we are going to be talking to you about the Lakeview Cemetery in Patchogue. And it is one of the chapters featured in my latest book, Haunted Long Island Mysteries, which came out in the fall of 2021. And this isn't this particular chapter is not one that we have really spoken about during the fall book tour at our lectures. So
Right.
It's all new. If you don't have the book, these will be some new stories for you tonight. So thank you for joining us, and we're looking forward to getting started tonight. So originally we were looking for a place in the Patchogue area because I only had, out of all the ghost books I've written, we only had one other place located in Patchogue. So we were looking and we had this one place in mind, but unfortunately that fell through. So I started doing a little bit more digging around to see if there was anything that came up as far as a place being haunted. And oddly enough, it was the Lakeview Cemetery that popped up. Now, normally Joe and I don't do cemeteries. I know a lot of these ghost hunting shows, they focus only on cemeteries. We like to, we don't really go to them that often. You would think that we do, but again, we try to be respectful in the work we do. But with this particular cemetery, there were so many stories related to it over the years that I decided to include it because the backstories to them were very interesting. It actually, the first ghost story at Lakeview Cemetery actually went back to the 1800s. It was listed in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle in 1895. So there's all sorts of strange stories that surround this cemetery and just how it's laid out. And if you go to it, it is an odd place and it was in disrepair for many, many years. It still needs some fixing up, but they've been working on it. I had made a phone call to the Patchogue village historian, whose name is Hans Henke. He's also a relative. Not a relative, a resident, I'm sorry, of Patchogue. And when I spoke to him on the phone to get some information, he said, well, when are you and Joe going? I'll actually, I have time, I can meet you at the cemetery. And Hans proved to be a wealth of information for us that day. Not only did he join us at the cemetery and talk to us about the different graves and things, but afterwards, Joe and I went back to his house and met his wife. And he has like a mini historical society of his own. And he's written a couple of books, which I purchased. And
Right.
He was a wealth of information, right, Joe? Can you tell us a little bit about how the rest of the day went?
Sure. Well, first I have to talk about the wind.
Yes, it was a crazy day.
It was a crazy day. And it's interesting because when I went back there with my team, sometime after, I don't remember the exact date, but we went back there. It's the same kind of thing, except that it was like 30 degrees out.
Mhm,
And
yeah.
we were there and later in the day and everybody was freezing and the wind again was howling. So we met Hans at the cemetery. And there was a time when the cemetery was badly neglected and really overgrown. And Hans was involved in a restoration project. Now, he had a wonderful sense of humor. At the end of this, our presentation, we do the ghost box recordings. We have a couple of funny clips from him.
Yeah.
He added some fun to the day, which I think took the edge off the fact that it was really so hospitable there. It was very much needed because we learned of the disturbing fates of many of the people who lay at rest there. It was very sad. So we did, we went back to his house. It was interesting. I actually have a couple of photos of you and him at the house going over the historical documents. First, I want to play something for you here. I think you'll enjoy this. This is for our viewers, just to get an idea of the wind situation there that we had going on. There's a view. That's the entrance.
I mean, even the entrance, it's very different than most cemeteries going in.
It is very different. It's almost like, come on in, and then be prepared. Let's see, I think this is it here. Lakeview Cemetery. Older section. It's just runs a minute or so, but because even as I edited these three clips
Yeah,
together,
the wind.
Yeah, the wind actually keeps getting worse and worse.
There's Hans.
It even disrupts the camera here a little bit. You'll see the feet kind of, yeah.
Look at that
And I
tree
keep
that came
saying
down.
is that. Yeah, I know. That's crazy.
You hear Hans say, "Oh boy."
Look at my hair blowing around. It really
are.
was windy.
It was.
It was
And then
really windy.
it
So
was very windy.
oh, this is back at Hans' house.
This is because you mentioned, so here we
Right.
are. So it was really great. You had this table laid out with all these documents, and it was literally, like you said, it was like a mini historical society.
Yeah.
Miss Hans,
Oh, this is a great shot of him.
it's just explaining everything, going over the
Right.
stories. So, yeah, so
Oh, that's excellent. That's excellent. I mean, we had trouble getting doing ghost box recordings that day because of the fact that it was so windy. We just but I think you
Yeah.
have a couple of clips here and there, but
we
not.
did, yeah, we have one. Actually, when we were sitting in his van.
Oh, okay. All right.
but,
So not
I
in the
think you-
cemetery itself.
I think you want to talk about the history. of the
Yeah,
place.
let's get to the history of that first. First of all, I want to give you the location of it. The cemetery is actually located on the corner of Waverly Avenue and Main Street, next to the former site of a lace mill. A portion of the land has been donated by a generous and wealthy Patchogue resident named Ruth Newey Smith in the late 1800s. The cemetery is actually comprised of 5 separate cemeteries. And you can actually see this when you're in there. You could see sort of where one ends and one begins. And the cemeteries are named the following: the Episcopal, the Waverly, the Girard, the Rice, and then Lakeview, with Lakeview being the most recent. So that's why it's known primarily as the Lakeview Cemetery. Over the years, the adjoining cemeteries have been referred to as this. So and you could see the separation between the different
Yeah.
ones.
And you could feel it the first time we got there. I kind of felt like there was just this big conglomeration of cemeteries. It's like, where does it start and where does it end? It was so open. It's almost like they should have put fences up on each one, but there's no delineation. So it's a little daunting when you first see it. The oldest graves, some of them date back to 1794, can be found in the Episcopal, the Girard, and the Waverly portion of the cemetery. Now, one time a congregational church had been located on the northeast corner of Main Street and Waverly Avenue, and it built in the late 1700s. Now, over 1,200 people are buried in the combined cemeteries, including at least 13 Revolutionary War veterans, 9 from the Civil War, 12 veterans from World War I, and 6 from World War II. So quite a time range of activity there. In addition, there are also 3 Vietnam veterans buried in the cemetery, as well as possible slaves in unmarked graves.
Yeah, I mean, and there are all sorts of strange stories surrounding the cemetery. And apparently, as I mentioned before, the earliest reported ghost sighting appeared in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle in 1895. I have to admit that when we were there, Joe, it was exceptionally windy, as you had mentioned, but I sensed immediately that the cemetery was an odd place, right?
Yes, yeah, it is. And
we're going to show you some photos and you'll
Yes.
see what we're talking about.
Yeah,
So
we'll get
Joe's
to-
going to put 2 photos up for us. Now, there's a historic marker and stone that appear to the left of the cemetery entrance and states that this was the location of Hart's Tavern, where President George Washington dined on April 22nd, 1790. The exact location of this tavern was unknown. However, there was another house located on the property from the same time period, and some believe perhaps the house and tavern were one and the same. A newspaper article from the 1800s makes mention of, in quotes, the haunted house on Blood Hill, which was described as, again, in quotes, an ancient house dating back to the Revolutionary War. It's funny how they referred to it as an ancient house.
Yes, right.
And this was the 1800s.
That's true.
There are various stories as to where the name Blood Hill came from. Some say drunken sailors would visit Patchogue and get into fights, and the streets were, in quotes again, running with blood. Other accounts state that because of the horrifying things that purportedly happened in the old house, it became known as the haunted house on Blood Hill. So this next slide shows a stone marker that says it's the site of Hart's Tavern, visited by George Washington. So we don't really know if this was, it probably was the site because this is the part that's closest to the street. So you would think that that was the case.
Yes, and the original home was believed to have been owned by Squire Brewster Woodhull, which was a possible relative of the Revolutionary War hero Nathaniel Woodhull. It's unknown exactly when the house was built and by whom, but records indicate that the Brewster Woodhull sold the house to Seba, is it Seba Smith or Seba Smith?
Seba Smith.
Smith, yeah, and his wife Elizabeth Oakes Smith in 1860. Now, she and Seba were quite well known in literary circles, and they came to Patchogue in 1859, which really isn't that long ago when you think about history.
Right.
Mid 1800s, Civil War, period.
Mm-hmm.
They purchased what was called the Woodhull Mansion, which was a 3-story rambling house that was located next door to the older part of the cemetery. After they renovated the house, they call it the Willows. It's interesting too. I was thinking willow trees blowing in the wind. It certainly is the right place for.
Yeah, it is.
And since it had been surrounded by willow trees. Now in 1868, only 8 years after they moved in, Seba died. And Elizabeth remained in the home for 2 years after her husband's death. And she moved out in 1870. Unfortunately, the house during her husband's absence had become quite run down.
So I'm sure by that point too, once the house started getting run down, it probably started already getting a reputation. But a number after she had moved out, a number of families had lived there. They had a number of owners apparently. And it is believed that the last occupants of the house were a group of Italian railroad workers who left the house abandoned and in complete disarray. Apparently, anyone who lived there did not stay long, and we don't really know why. So maybe something was going on, because people did report that strange noises and other unexplained things occurred there, seemingly coming from the basement. Now, according to my research, and again, this can't be proven, but according to what I found, it had been long rumored that prior to the abolition of slavery in New York City in 1827, that a slave pen was located in the basement of the house. Just who owned it at the time of this, it is not known, but many Patchogue residents have claimed that they heard screaming coming from the basement of this house at that time, and that there were in fact slaves there that were being tortured and killed. It was rumored, and this is absolutely hideous, it was rumored that some of the dead slaves were dragged from the basement and were buried in unmarked graves in the older portions of the cemetery. And there are areas of the cemetery where there are no gravestones, and you wonder, like, why is this part left, without stones?
That could be where they were.
Yeah. So, but even after the slaves were removed and the house was completely abandoned, people still claim that they heard screams from the tortured souls, and that they could be heard, which led to the belief that the house on Blood Hill was in fact haunted. There were numerous reports throughout the 1800s that a dark figure of a ghost carrying a blue flannel lantern, a blue flamed lantern, I should say, could be seen walking in the old cemetery near the house. Residents of Patchogue would at all costs avoid walking past this house. They were that terrified of it. They would cross to the other side if they had to walk down the street. So that's why we believe too that those markers are pretty accurate as to where that house would have been. Now, the house burned down in a mysterious fire sometime between 1881 and 1893. Even when the house was gone, people still claim to have heard sounds and claim to have seen ghostly figures roaming the area where the house once stood. I mean, and again, this is from an actual article from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle from the 1800s.
Yes, there's some credibility there. And also, it's interesting, when we went there during the day and when I went back there during the day, we found it so noisy. And I know that a lot of the people that I've talked to that do investigate there, they go there like 3 o'clock in the morning because it's the only time it's quiet. And I'm guessing that corner of the cemetery where the old stones were, where the video was that I took, that's probably where you would see or hear these screams or see these apparitions. If you were going to go there, you have to go at like really late at night.
Right. Yeah, because it is on busy corners.
It's very busy. Around 1895, there were more ghost stories and sightings had been reported after the burial of the victims from the Lewis 5 place shipwreck. The land where the mansion, we're going to talk about that shipwreck, but the land where the mansion once stood had been purchased by Augustus Smith Weeks, one of the 4 prominent Smith sisters of Patchogue. When she heard the story of what befell the sailors on that tragic day, she generously donated a plot and stones so they could have a proper Christian burial. Now, long after the sailors were buried, ghostly activity increased, and many local townspeople reported seeing apparitions. It was rumored that a headless apparition, perhaps one of the doomed sailors, was seen more than once hovering over the graves of the newly dead. Others reported hearing screams and wailing sounds. Kind of reminds me of what we heard at the Execution Rocks.
Yes, very similar. And they had died at sea as well. This is an absolutely horrifying story.
Horrible story.
And it was, the research I found, it was written at length. I mean, really going into details. I'm going to try to summarize it a little bit for you today. But what was interesting, when Joe and I went to the Long Island Maritime Museum, they have a display, and we're going to show you a slide of that soon. But that story continues into that chapter on the Long Island Maritime Museum, because this was one of the most well-known shipwrecks on Long Island.
Kerriann, the sailors are sitting down listening now.
Yeah, I could imagine. So it's quite a story. So I'd like to share it with you. On February 8th, 1895, the 163-foot 3-mast schooner called the Louis, and it's actually Louis V.
Thank you, Louis
Joe.
V. Sorry,
Yeah.
I was doing the Roman numeral
Right,
thing.
exactly. Sailed from Baltimore to New York, carrying 1,100 tons of coal. It had left port in Baltimore on January 28th, and it was off the coast of Cape Charles, Virginia on February 5th, when a terrible storm arrived. Temperatures were freezing, and the sails, hull, and rigging were icing up. 2 days later, severe winds and bitter cold made the cruise journey even more treacherous. The sea was getting rougher. Now, by 7:00 a.m. on February 8th, the captain, whose name was William Squire, had lost his bearings. The ship was leaking, and with everything being frozen, the vessel became completely unmanageable. The lines were frozen, and the sailors in their weakened state could not free them. There are pictures of this, by the way, if you do a Google search, but because of copyright issues, we couldn't include them. But you would not believe the photographs of the rigging. I mean, encased in ice that looked like, in some cases, almost a foot deep in ice. Absolutely horrible. So Captain Squire had ordered the sailors to put on all of their clothes that they had, and that they should remain in the aft part of the ship. So 10 minutes later, after all this was going on with them getting ready, the ship hit a sandbar, and the pounding sea broke over the decks, because remember, they didn't have navigation systems, and he could not see. He totally was spun around.
Not now weather either.
Yeah, and I think they got as low as 40 feet of water, and this was, a decent sized ship. And then they did hit the sandbar. So the ship ran aground an 1/8 of a mile east of Lone Hill Life Saving Station, which was located on Fire Island. 2 surfmen from that station saw the wreck and went for help. However, with the heavy surf, the rescue crews could not launch their lifeboats. They just couldn't go out into the seas. They had made several attempts to launch a Lyle gun, which is a small, it's like a gun that's like similar to a cannon that launches out, line and rope to the lifeboats. So they're called rescue lines, basically, but they could not reach them. The ones that did go far enough, the sailors aboard the Louis V place were so cold that they actually became debilitated and they could not reach the lines that finally did get to them. They couldn't handle them at all. Their hands were frozen. So trying to avoid the constant pounding of the icy waves, the men managed to climb into the ship's rigging, and they attached themselves to the masts.
I wonder why. I'm just trying to imagine why they would do that, to be further up into, exposed up in this like that.
Well, unless the ship could have been going down, it was taking
Yeah,
on
that's
water.
that's what I'm thinking.
You know?
Yeah, that there was probably water slashing over the sloshing over the deck. The doomed sailors stayed in like this for 2 days.
It's hard to believe.
I can't imagine this. The captain was the first to fall, his body being swept out to sea. The cook was the next to fall. His body had been completely frozen. By 8 p.m., the engineer who had fought to stay alive tumbled into the sea. Soon after, 2 other sailors froze to death and were found hanging from the lines. There were only 3 crew members left. 2 found a way to make a shelter out of cutting the lashing of the mizzen topsail, which had been furled, and they were able to fit themselves into the hole. They made a desperate attempt to get the other sailor to join him, but he was trapped and was unable to get around the mast. By Saturday morning, he had died, and he was found frozen where he'd been sitting.
I mean, can you imagine? It's horrifying. To me, they really should make, there's so much information on this. They should make a movie about it.
Oh my God.
Yeah, because
yes.
it's really 2 days from hell.
It's
really
true. This would be an amazing movie.
Yeah. So at this point, there were still 2 remaining men that kept themselves alive for several hours more. You know how they did this? By actually hitting one another to keep the blood flow circulating. Once the storm had subsided, the men with the lifeboats were able to then row out to them. Now, the 2 sailors, though, were badly frozen. I mean, you figure this is, hours and 2 days. The next day, another boat was launched and rescuers went back to the shipwreck, and they cut down the bodies of the men who were frozen to the rigging. 8 plots with 8 stones were set in Lakeview Cemetery, but only 4 of the sailors are buried there. In a morbid detail, it is said that Gustav Jaby, who was a sailor from Norway, was buried in his grave with a frozen piece of rope still attached to his hand.
As for the fate of the 2 remaining survivors, Soren Nelson died of tetanus a few weeks later on March 2nd, and Klaus Stuvens went back to working on the sea. I heard a bang. Was that you?
Probably when I put my water down.
Oh, okay. It sounded like our spirit.
I had a spirit rep.
He had, maybe it's Klaus. He had gained notoriety as the ship's sole survivor, and for many years he gave lengthy interviews about the tragedy. Although he never went back to the only profession he had ever known, he was never the same. He went back to it, but he was never the same after that. We'd often recall how he clung to the icy rigging for 39 hours. Can you imagine this?
No.
While he watched each of his shipmates freeze to death and washed out to sea. Eventually, he was committed to Central Islip Psychiatric Hospital, and he died in 1902. One of the stones in the sailor's plot at Lakeview Cemetery is his.
Yeah, I mean, it is hard to believe. And that's why there is so much information on the shipwreck, because of Klaus.
Yeah, he had a journal.
Yeah,
right?
He had a journal. I actually read some of his journal pieces. It's hard to believe. I mean, what a thing to survive. But that's why he was not mentally well after that. From what he must have seen was absolutely horrible. Now, there was a sailor who was out without a stone, and that was Charles Morrison, who was the cook. Some say his body was never found, while other accounts say because he was of dark skin, he could not be buried on consecrated ground. There were rumors that he was buried in the dunes at a nearby beach in an unmarked grave. Apparently, when it was discovered that the man was in fact a Christian, some local townspeople went back to retrieve the body, only to find it missing. Many people believe it is Morrison who haunts the cemetery because he is not buried with his crew.
We
Awful.
have some pictures.
Okay.
there. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, this is in the Long Island Maritime Museum, and this is a display that they actually have about the Louis V place. And I do believe that that's the actual board. If you see it, if you go back to that other slide for a minute, Joe, see how it's broken on the right-hand side?
Mhm. Oh,
That's-
that's from the ship
That's
itself.
from the ship, yeah.
Wow, that's
See,
crazy.
all of these pieces that you see are from the ship. So if you see
Well-
the next one, this is a,
The hoop, is that the
yeah,
hoop, the ring?
it's the mast hoop. But I don't know if you could see it on the slide. In the hoop, okay, it says the ghost in the rigging. Now, I didn't notice this when we were there, Joe, but whoever had taken these photos, it appeared that there was a ghost in the rigging. And this, again, this goes back to when this event happened. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Mhm.
And
I added
here's
this-
Claus
Yeah, I added this
Stebbins.
picture.
Mhm.
That's him, right? Mhm.
Yeah, I forgot we had this at Hans had this, yep. That's his photo. And then these are the graves at Lakeview Cemetery, how they're all lined up. I mean, you wonder what would have happened to them. And this
know.
is the one that we told you about that was frozen to the mast.
Yeah, and
That's one
was-
story, but there's another
it's
one.
another strange and interesting feature in Lakeview Cemetery is the 22-foot high memorial, which is located on the north end of the cemetery at the end of the center driveway, which you saw the picture of the car, that driveway comes in. The monument was erected in 1909 by Ruth Newey Smith, sister of Augustus Smith Weeks. Now, the Smith family were active community members, so Ruth took it upon herself to create a memorial in memory of the three sisters and their parents, who were among the first settlers of Patchogue. 4 life-size statues representing faith, hope, charity, and liberty sit atop the capstone, which measures 5 feet by 4 inches square. Wrapped around the monument is the geological history, which is fascinating to see this. You guys should go and see this.
Yeah.
It's the geological history of the Smith family from 1641 to 1909 in 3,000 words, consisting of 18,000 one-inch letters. Can you imagine this?
I mean, this is all carved. We're going to
It's
show you a
carved.
photo.
Yeah.
This is carved,
Carved.
3,000 words carved into these stones.
Incredible. The cost of the monument in 1909 was $5,000. It is said to weigh approximately 5 tons. Now, elsewhere on the property is a large plot which contains the graves of the Smith family. Dominating this plot are 4 20-foot high memorial columns. The sight of these columns and monuments only adds to the oddity of the unusual cemetery. And
It
I have some
does,
pictures.
yeah, it does, because when you come and you see these massive,
Yeah,
I mean, they're really massive.
they are. Yeah, let me show you some pictures of them here. Here we go.
Okay, so here are the 4 columns. Now, if you look off to the right, you could see how tall these are in comparison to the tombstones in the background.
Mhm.
And I mean, this one is very elaborate with the sculpture of the woman on top. Here's a side view of it. And also, if you stay on the slide for a second, Joe, see how on the left, you see that fencing, like the wrought iron fencing. This is how the cemetery is divided to those different sections, the Waverly section and everything.
Mhm.
So it gives you an idea of that.
And yet it's still open. It's not
Yeah.
like you don't have to go through
Right.
gates.
Exactly. So here's the one that's towards the back of the cemetery, the massive one. And if you look in that midsection, it's hard to see, but that's all lettering. That's where all of the wording is, the Smith family history.
Yeah.
I should have taken a close
A
up of
photo,
that.
yes, exactly.
Yeah, but
But
it's
it's
the
quite
detail
amazing.
of this with all of the sisters, it's incredible.
Yeah, I probably have a close-up of it, but I'd have to upload it and all,
Mm-hmm.
so.
Here's another view of it. And I like this shot because, again, look at how massive it is
It is.
compared to the stones in the background.
And not only that, but the fact that it wasn't just this one stone, there were these 4 columns and then they had this stone, that there was just so much money and expense and time put in. I don't know how long did it take to carve this? I wonder.
I'm not sure. It probably took quite a while, but $5,000 was a lot back in
Yeah,
that
it's a lot of
day
money
to
back
make
then.
it. Yeah.
I mean, back then in the early 1900s, even when movies were beginning, I mean, my mom, she was born in, in the early 1920s, and I think you could go to a movie for like a couple of pennies or 5 cents or
Yeah.
something. So here's another picture of it.
Mhm. Okay, we'll hold off on that slide for a moment.
Mhm.
Now, this last story I want to tell you about is probably the most gruesome of them all. And it reminds me a lot of when I was working on my historical crime book. It's a bit of a gruesome story, but the point of when I was writing my historic crime book is that it was very different from other books that were out there of the same nature because of the fact that I never glorified the criminal. It was important for me, I guess, because of the work I do with the ghost books, to sort of give a voice to the victims. And this story could have been in the historic
Yep, I
crime
agree.
book, so there was sort of, when I was writing this, I wanted to be respectful as far as what happened to these poor children, because there's a lot of information. This is another one that could be a movie. There's that much information on it. It's the story of 7-year-old Helen Tiernan. On May 16th, 1937, there was another girl, a 16-year-old girl, was walking through the woods because, again, this is the cemetery now, it's kind of built up, but back in the day, it was wooded around it. So she was walking through the woods near her house, collecting flowers for her teacher when she made a grisly discovery. And again, this wasn't that far away from the cemetery.
Kerriann, can I just chime in for a second before you go? That's one thing that I wrote down for myself as an impression with the place. And this I was trying to say earlier about there being no real dividing lines between all the cemeteries. It seemed very barren to me when you go in there. It's this windswept, gigantic, flat space. There are no trees. I mean, there are trees all the old slave section, but that's
it was a bit haphazard. I guess
but
would be
back
a good
then
way.
It was probably more beautiful, more pretty. There were flowers and trees and stuff.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to chime in how it's changed.
Yeah, it has. And I honestly don't know where the woods were in relation to the cemetery, but it had to have been somewhat close by. So anyway, so this girl, I think her name was May, was walking through the woods looking for flowers when she came across the badly burned body of a young girl lying in the weeds. Her throat had been slashed. So the girl ran and got a friend, and then they called the police. When the police started searching the area for clues, one of the officers saw something moving nearby in a tall patch of weeds. To his surprise, he found another child. It was a young boy who was covered in bruises, and he also had his throat cut. But they were not as deep as the ones in the girl's throat. The boy was rushed to the hospital, and the police continued to search the area, believing that the mother of the children must be lying dead nearby. However, there was no body that was found. It was just the two children. Instead, the search turned up a bloody knife, a bloody hatchet, and a half-empty container of gasoline. An investigation began, and photos of the surviving 5-year-old boy were in newspapers everywhere. The little boy was so traumatized that it was difficult for them to get information from him. All he remembered, and this is what he told the police, was that he remembered seeing his mother hitting his sister. A nursery school teacher who recognized the boy from the newspapers came forward and identified him as Jimmy Tiernan, son of Helen Tiernan.
When the police approached her, Helen denied knowing anything about the death of her daughter and the attack on her son. After being questioned further, she finally confessed to the crimes. As the story goes, Helen, who was 25, had been widowed for 3 years. She had recently met George Christie, a former boxer and restaurant worker, who became her lover. He moved into her small apartment, and Helen demanded the children call George father. After a while, George got fed up with the children and the living arrangements and threatened to leave Helen. Panicked, she decided to leave the city and take a drive out to Long Island, as she was familiar with the woods in Brookhaven town from having attended a church retreat near there. She and the children boarded a train and headed out east to the location. She told the children she was taking them on a trip to the country. She entered the woods on the easterly side of Yaphank Avenue and walked approximately 150 yards into the woods where the attacks took place. Meanwhile, George Christie was told by Helen that she had sent her children to go and live with her brother. The day after the atrocities, the two lovers spent time laughing and enjoying the beach, and even had their photo taken. Is that
Yeah,
sick or
I mean,
what?
the woman was definitely,
I,
unfortunately, she had a lot of mental illness.
and I don't know how much, her husband, lover really knew about what she did
Right.
until after.
Yeah, I don't think so. And just to clarify, her daughter was also named, after her was named Helen.
Helen, right.
So it's unclear what happened to the little boy named Jimmy after he recovered in a Patchogue hospital. His only known relative was his grandfather, but he showed no interest in taking Jimmy. I mean, it's just so sad.
I know.
Other sources say his uncle had considered it, but ultimately it is believed that Jimmy may have wound up in an orphanage in New York City. Helen Tiernan was convicted and sentenced to serve 28 years behind bars in the Bedford State Prison in New York. Expressing some remorse for murdering her daughter, she asked for money to be taken out of her account to be used for a burial. That was about the only thing that she, did for her daughter.
I just can't imagine how people can do stuff like this. Young Helen Tiernan's body was taken to C.W. Rulin's undertaking establishment in Patchogue, the same place where the sailors from the Louis V place had been displayed for the public. The building still stands today and is now Reese's 1900 restaurant. That's interesting. I didn't know that restaurant. Helen was laid to rest in Lakeview Cemetery. It is said that only her grandfather attended the funeral. Maybe the whole family was messed up.
Yeah.
Some workers from the adjacent lace mill took it upon themselves to purchase a headstone for Helen, which still remains today. For many years, flowers would appear at the gravesite, but no one ever knew who was placing them there.
Yeah, it's incredible. We couldn't find her stone. Again, the cemetery has gone through various stages, and it's better than it was, but it still has some issues as far as how it's laid out and how it's been presented to the public. But it's interesting. We talked about. We lost the screen for a second, Joe. Hold on.
You there?
Yeah, I'm still here, but I lost the screen on my side.
Oh, hold on.
Oh, there we go. I'm back. Okay.
Okay.
Reese's 1900 restaurant. I don't know if any of you have been there. We have not, but it's hard to believe that used to be an undertaking office. So I wonder, we should go back and see about doing an investigation there.
It might be haunted.
It might be haunted with all of these different things that had taken place.
Yeah.
We just told you tonight about some of the stories, but along with these stories, there have been other ghostly activity reported at Lakeview Cemetery. There were numerous reports of people hearing the sound of a young girl crying. So could that have been Helen Tiernan? We can only hope that she has crossed over to the other side and that she's no longer suffering. Other people have also claimed to have seen the apparition of a young girl wandering around the tombstone. So again, could this be the ghost of Helen Tiernan? We don't know, but to this day, there's still rumors around the cemetery. And again, there are numerous articles talking about the things that people have witnessed over the years.
Mm-hmm. So we have some pictures here. Let me cue them up here. Let me know they show up. You see it?
Okay, so here's another, we had this up before, but this is a good example again, how Joe was saying that nothing is locked, but this is this separate part of the cemetery that you could just walk through. it's interesting. I don't really know why they ended up putting all these separators. Why wouldn't they have just taken them down and make it one big cemetery? I don't know, but they kept the dividers amongst many of the
And
various cemeteries.
these wrought iron fence here looks pretty old, so this might be one of the original.
Yeah. Mhm. And then there's a number of these. I guess they're probably family plots
Mhm.
that are outlined, but you could see how it's right by these homes. I mean, there's nothing.
No. I wondered when Hans did the restoration, this is probably stuff that he did, right?
Yeah, I
Probably
mean,
some of
we
this.
saw some of the photos that Hans had taken before the restoration of the cemetery, and it was so overgrown, you couldn't see any of the stones. So he
Mhm.
really worked hard with a team of people to get it the way it is today. And like I said, there's still work that needs to be done, but he's got it to at least where it's a respectful place now. So here's a picture of Hans and Joe walking in the cemetery.
Look like the movie, it looks like a scene from The Godfather. No, and another interesting thing about the cemetery, most cemeteries like Union Cemetery, which is practically across the street, it's down the street. They all have drive-through, they have roads.
Mhm.
This doesn't. This has this
Yeah,
kind
you're
of dirt
right.
road.
It has
right?
just that one dirt
That
road.
one
You're
road, and
correct.
there's but look how huge it is.
Yeah,
I mean,
that is interesting. I never thought about that, Joe. There's no
Yeah.
other road except that main one.
we were
Uh,
parked on, and the road isn't even really a road. It's just kind of a
Yeah.
clearing area. In fact, when
And then it
Hans
circles
parked it-
around. It circles around that
It
one
circles
huge
around.
monument.
yeah,
That's where it
and,
ends at that.
and I remember when we
back
were
of it.
parked, I didn't know whether to put the tires on the cement or on the ground, because it was you really didn't fit on this narrow road.
Yeah, it's true. And this, if you go back to the other slide for a minute, Joe, I like this shot because again, you see those four
They're huge.
monuments. I mean, it just looks very odd when you're looking at the rest of these stones, and some of
Mhm.
these here are a little bit more modern. It's odd that the trees have issues and are broken, and branches off,
Yeah.
things of that nature. Here's another view. So you could see it's really built up around the cemetery now. This I thought was odd because I never, going back through these photos, Joe, look at the shape of this tree.
I
Just how
see
the
that. I didn't
branches-
notice it. It looks like a
re-
pitchfork.
Yeah, it looks like a pitchfork. And it also just reminds me of those monuments all lined up. But I
That
put
is
this in
really,
because,
I
thought that was
didn't
very
notice
odd.
that.
Yeah.
That is odd. That is ghostly.
Just
No,
that was
I
odd. And
didn't
I
notice.
didn't notice until I was sending you the photos.
Is that the
to
same
slide
tree?
presentation.
That's the same tree? Or is it a couple of trees that are kind of just optical illusion?
That's one tree, I
That's
believe.
one tree.
Yeah.
Wow, that is bizarre. I'm
Yeah.
surprised no one has ever mentioned that as sort of
I
a,
don't know. I did not notice it until I started going through these photos again.
wow,
So
that's crazy.
yeah.
That is bizarre. What are the odds of it growing like that?
Yeah. Here's another one of Hans and
It's
Joe.
kind of a nice picture.
Yeah, I
It's
like this one.
yeah. And this is you, got a shot of you there. This is when we were at
And then they have that building. I forget what that is behind it.
Oh, I think that's, I think
Was
that's
it a
the brewery.
recreation center? Or?
It might be the brewery. There's a brewery
Okay.
and there's also a college behind here, I think.
Okay.
Might be the college, not sure though. Maybe one of our listeners viewers could let us know.
Oh, this is with your group now. So this
Yeah,
was,
yeah,
oh, wait, we have here, it's, what does that say? Trident for those who died on the ship.
what are you reading?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we went back there and you could see, again, it was kind of an inhospitable day. Everybody's bundled up in these
Oh, the
heavy
tree
coats.
she's talking about. Okay. Oh,
Oh, the
it's from
tree, yeah.
Michael. Wait, it's from Michael Walsh. Okay, saying it's the tree. Okay, thank
Oh,
you
it's
for
true,
clarifying.
okay. Mhm.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So this was again, Joe, this obviously was in colder weather. So this
Yes.
must have been the fall that you went back a couple of months later.
We-
We weren't
we
in the
did.
spring.
We did, and it was again during the pandemic. I think this was one of the last events that I did outside, and it was it was freezing. It was like literally below 30 degrees and the wind was howling. So the wind chill was probably like 10 degrees.
And did anyone get anything?
We got some things. Mostly we just did a ghost. You're going to hear, we did a ghost box session. We all gathered in a circle and we gave our impressions about stuff. A lot of the ghost box was personal stuff, like somebody's mom came through, things like that. But the first part of it, where we kind of said hello to the spirits, I got a few recordings from that, so we'll get to hear that. But I think everyone got so consumed with the cold, we were just happy to get out of there.
Yeah.
So, but they did enjoy the tour. We walked around. I showed them the older part of the cemetery where the Revolutionary War and the slave graves were. So, okay, I think that's all we had on that.
Did I have?
Yes.
Oh yeah, here we go.
Yeah.
I knew we had other pictures.
Mhm.
This is the older section, and you could see the difference in the stones. This and to the left where those trees are
Yes.
the older stones. And Joe walking amongst the older stones.
All right, so that's the end of those slides. And then, okay, so I want to talk a little bit about my impression before we play. So we have a couple of recordings. The place is very sad and very barren. As you mentioned earlier, Hans' personality added another dimension to our investigation. It made it less haunting and more humorous. And this began when I saw Hans's vehicle in the middle of the road, if you could call it a road, not quite parked correctly, with one of the two tires straddling the concrete edges. It was kind of funny seeing you sitting in the middle of this barren spot when I arrived, because I got there after you did.
And I don't even know, did you know, because this was all a last minute thing. So I don't even know if you knew that he was meeting us there.
No, I don't know if I
Right,
did.
because then you pull in and you see me in this man's car and you're
Yeah, and I was like, I didn't know what was going on.
right,
And, it felt like we were teenagers sneaking around the graveyard on Halloween
right.
with Hans' sense of humor, cracking all of us up. And I just saw an orb go by. And there was this melted, okay, so we were in the van. When I sat in the back of his car, I reached down into the handle to open the window or close the window, open the door, I think, when we were going to get out and walk, and my fingers dipped into chocolate that was melted in the door handle back from one of the kids or the grandchildren. And then there were the winds. So it just was kind of bizarre. So I'm going to play you a couple of
We always try to add some levity because some of these stories like Execution Rocks and things like that,
yeah.
it's very heavy to deal with. So
yeah, and
we try
just
to
wanna
lighten
say
it
that
up without being disrespectful.
Exactly. Yeah, because the spirits, Kerriann and I feel like the spirits would be listening to our presentation. They want to make sure everything is correct and that we get the word out and what they went through and everything. So in a way, it's sort of a cleansing, it's sort of a crossing over for them that helps them even more to do that. So let me get PowerPoint up here. And here we go. Okay, so these first two clips are a little bit of the humor that was going on, that was kind of breaking the sadness, so we could keep working. Hans is very funny.
Yeah, it really was. We had a lot of fun with him. Oh, look at this. This is funny. He's showing me something, but it looks like he's pointing at me.
I know.
Two of them. They don't match at all.
It's like putting grandma in a Corvette,
What did he say? Looks like you're putting grandma on a Corvette?
In a Corvette.
Oh,
yeah, he said two stones that didn't match. So we have another clip from him. And this is about when we're talking about the ship and the shore stones.
This is the other ship here.
Okay, yeah, I didn't read about that. What's the other ship?
Well, you call these the ship and the shore.
This was the, yeah.
There's no water.
It rained.
You and I sounded very confused. The ship and the shore. It sounded like who's on first.
Exactly. And I don't know if it was the sailor's stones. I think there was this other stone, which is off camera to the right? That was the newer one.
Yeah, I don't remember
the town
what we were talking about.
Because I remember he was going on about this one stone that really didn't match the decor the energy of the cemetery.
Yeah,
It was
right.
more of like a modern stone.
Yeah.
So
And again,
um,
here you can see that roadway isn't even paved.
it's not, yeah, I
No,
mean,
it's
it's,
sad.
and it goes right by the sailors. So,
Yeah.
okay, so the next clip is actually timeline was after you and I went. This is when I came back with my team, but it is a short clip. And also it talks a little bit about some of the things. So I'm playing that one first, and then we'll play the Ghost Box recording that we all did, you, Hans, and I, that we did in his van. before that.
That's right. We did do one
We
in there.
did. We
Okay.
did a short one, and then we went out to the wind. We couldn't do it in the wind. We couldn't even hear
Okay.
each other in the wind.
But we
did
didn't
one
put it in the book, I think, because it was more difficult to hear than our other
right,
Ghostbusters
but it's
recordings.
not that bad. It's not bad. You have to listen carefully, but you can hear a few of the answers.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So so here's the first one.
Hi, spirits. How are you?
We're done.
What is that?
The spirits talking.
Lecture.
Lecture. Yes, it's a lecture. Hi, spirits. How are you?
This is fun.
This is fun. Did you hear him say that? So this is the ghost box.
Witches.
Witches. You heard witches? Yeah. It is very cold out. It's getting a lot colder. So we're not going to stay out too long. Is that all right with everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Did you hear him say thank you?
So that was, again, then when we went in, we asked some personal questions. People were getting
Right.
coming through.
You
that
got
they
some
knew.
great stuff. This is the first time that I'm even hearing this.
Yeah.
That's great.
And I want to go back and again, you know, if you're overanalyze some of this stuff, you're not going to really understand the messages, but there's always a hidden message. And here, when the spirit said we're docked, I mean, the way I read that we were doing this right near the stones, the sailors,
Mhm.
meaning they're docked, they're off the ship, they're in their resting place now.
Right.
And so I thought that was kind of cool that they communicated that.
Yes, definitely.
You know, okay, so here's our ghost box in the van with Hans.
And this was
And-
on the grounds of the cemetery.
On the
correct,
grounds
John?
of the cemetery, the first time when you and I went with Hans.
Okay, it's running. Hi, spirits. I think I heard hi there. How are you today, spirits?
How many slaves are buried here?
I heard 4.
Yeah, I heard
99.
That's a big difference between
4 and 9. I'm going to go with the 4.
Yeah.
You heard that, Hans, right?
No, I'm out of here.
Okay. Ask it one more time.
How many slaves are buried here? Are there unmarked graves?
Who is here? Could you say your name? Are the 4 sisters here? Hi, how are you? That sounded like someone in a room with an echo in the back, didn't it?
I'm going to write about the history of the cemetery in my new book.
You are?
And we have Revolutionary War soldiers buried here as well, yes?
When?
From the 1700s.
Yeah, they're talking. Is George Washington here?
Are the sailors from the shipwreck finally at peace?
Well, I heard great. Good.
Wow, Joe, that was good. I don't remember hearing that either.
Mhm.
I mean, it's not as clear as some of our other Ghostbusters
Right.
recordings that we play. That's why we didn't include it in the book, but you could definitely hear them. And it was funny because here we had just met Hans, and we didn't have much time to explain to him exactly what we do. And he just went with the flow. He was sitting there in the front. I think I was sitting in the front with him. I don't even know, like he said he was hard of hearing, but I don't even know if he heard anything we were doing. He was probably wondering what we were doing. Didn't seem to mind though. He just totally went with
He
the
just
flow,
went with the flow.
which
Yeah.
was a lot of fun. So, you know, it was great meeting him. I mean, like I said, it happened at the last minute. Joe and I were planning on going there. And I contacted him to find out something. And next thing you know, he said he was showing up, and we spent the whole time with him, and
Yeah, we
got to
went
go
to
to
his
his house,
house.
so-
He showed all the documents. And it's interesting too, because I think, did we do the Maritime Museum after?
we did. We
Yeah.
did.
And then we got to see the ship, the Louis.
Yeah, because no, actually they were both before COVID,
Before
but
COVID, right.
this was months later, I believe. So and then we did the Maritime Museum after that.
Right,
months
yeah.
after
And we saw the museum area where they had the
Yeah,
ship. And
Yeah.
it
But,
was
you know, the one thing, like I said, we normally don't do that many cemeteries, except like we've done in the book, the cemetery in Sag Harbor, which is Revolutionary
we did
War.
Potter's Field.
Cottersfield. But generally, we don't do them unless they have some kind of significance. And again, I really wanted to show, you know, what this place was about and who these victims were, and to keep their names out there and their stories out there, because, you know, it is very tragic, and it's important to keep this going and to record it so they're not forgotten. So that was a big thing for me in writing this particular piece. So before we get to our ending here, does anyone have any questions for us tonight? No, quiet audience tonight. So terrible that we can't see any of you, but I appreciate our regulars that join us on each of the webinars. So if you are interested in joining us again, we are going to do our last webinar for our series here on Wednesday, March 23rd. And it's going to be on the Brewster House in Setauket. We are going to have special guest historian Margot Arceri with us. She's joined us on our webinars in the past, and the Brewster House has a great history to it. And I know we do a lot of houses in Setauket, but it's a very special area, rich in history and ghost stories. And we had gotten some wonderful orbs and EVPs at the Brewster House. And to fill it in, because there are connections with the Culper Spiring. So Margot Arceri, who's an expert in this, she does tours in the area where the Culper Spiring, where everyone, you know, went through the woods over there. So she's going to fill in with some stories about the Culper Spiring for us. So if you're interested in that, you can sign up through my website. It's already up. And also I'll be sending out email blasts. I do want to remind you that all of these stories are appearing in my latest book, Haunted Long Island Mysteries, which if you're interested in getting a personalized or signed copy, you can get it directly through my website, and I'll get it out to you in just a couple of days. And you can follow Joe on Facebook and me on Facebook. And we just want to thank you for your support as we've been navigating these different times. So thank you all for joining us this evening.
Thank you, everybody. And you know, the weather's getting nicer, so don't forget, we'll be back in the fall as well.
With in live book signings and lectures.
Exactly.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.